Well, hey there, Gen Xers. We are here once again for another great episode of GenXTalkin Storytime.
Storytime.
Remember, these are these really interesting episodes that we have where we'll read a short clip of just some fictional type of environment where someone somewhere has gone through difficult times and they're in the midst of all those challenges, and then we open it up for questioning. And you and I go back and forth and we'll see where it leads us. But before we get there, Ed, welcome back.
Thank you, Matthew. It's great to be back. I'm excited for this episode, and I'm looking forward to next week. I want to tell the audience out there that we will be attempting to record a few very short updates live from Egypt next week. I'm going to be in Cairo, Luxor, and Hurghada, as the Arabs say, inshallah, or Lord willing.
Nice. That's going to be exciting. Number one, because we've never done live or international recordings, so that should be fun. But number two, so cool that you're getting to travel and internationally. That's going to be fun. I think because of COVID and stuff, it's still a little iffy, a little weird, but I'm excited to see how things are for you when you get out there.
It's going to be interesting. It's a little bit of a challenge already. And another exciting aspect of it is we'll be at least with, if not interviewing, a guest named Chris Klein, who's a world traveler, has been to about 66 countries in the last few years.
Dang, that's a traveling dude for sure.
Yep.
Now, does he do that for business, or what does he do?
He's got a little bit of a business thing going on, and he's kind of doing this working from home in his business, and partially for just travel pleasure as well.
Yeah.
And one of the things he'll cover with us is one of his favorite tools while he's traveling, which is a geo-tracking device that will contact local rescue people if you're ever in the middle of nowhere and you fall or something like that.
Yeah. Well, that might be a tool that we'll have to add to our bug out bags. So that'll be cool to hear about.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear about that, but I'm excited to hear about this story time.
The title of it today is Out of Gas, but it's not a vehicle driving down the road and you run out of gas. It's a little more complex than that. Today, for our entertainment, but more importantly, our consideration, I'll introduce you to Travis and Nikki Lopez. They were what many call an average American. Their childhoods were not spent living in large cities or playing in the country club or anything like that during the weekends. They were spent living with middle-class parents in small towns just outside of, let's say, average America, Tulsa, Oklahoma. They met in college, surprised everyone. Travis and Nikki got married right after graduation. They took the first 10 years of their new careers to move up the corporate ladder. Travis in IT at a regional airline. Nikki was an HR executive at a restaurant chain. Both were quite successful. They became part of the upper class. Eventually, they became parents of two young children. Now, during an eventful week at work, Travis started to recognize some strange things going on at his company. There had been multiple episodes of the company canceling hundreds of flights. To the media, the company executives kept blaming it on a computer glitch. However, being in the higher levels of IT, Travis knew this was untrue. He went to his boss, Alan, to review the issue. And Alan says, well, hey, I'm not supposed to tell you anything. I'm not supposed to say anything to anyone, but you know how we couldn't figure out what these computer glitches are? Well, the real reason for the cancellations was because the airline was short on fuel. Our supplier didn't have enough fuel to give us, and we had to cancel all those flights to overcome the shortage. I think the execs were worried that the global fuel shortage is building and our fuel costs are about to blow out through the roof. Now, if you say, hey, the world is short of fuel because of the Middle East situation or a global fuel shortage, then everyone panics, right? About the end of the world coming and stock prices plummet. And remember, it's all about stock prices to those guys in the corner offices.
Yep.
Well, Travis did a bunch more research. Was there a global fuel shortage, large enough to start affecting flight schedules? Was the ongoing recession part of a fuel shortage? What were those in charge, including the media, not telling us, and why? You see, Travis had been raised with the attitude if it wasn't reported on the major news networks, then it wasn't worth reporting at all. It was drummed into his head that his favorite news anchor was honest and above reproach, and that the news services spent millions of dollars investigating reports around the world to keep everyone up to date. Travis kept digging, and he found the news sources of fuel were being contracted for during that time of those shortages. And the news sources couldn't always fill the gaps between what was being shorted by the main supplier and the amount the airline actually needed. So there are at least 11 occasions in the past 18 months during which the additional suppliers weren't able to supply the fuel needed. Additionally, while the government kept saying there's no real inflation to be worried about, Travis started doing his own little version of a consumer price index, and he found out that it was actually 10 to 15% inflation rate. So that's on most of those items that you would get on a normal day, what he and Nikki, in this case, would purchase on a regular month. From grocery items to the meals at their favorite restaurants, even with Nikki being in the restaurant industry with her executive discounts, they still saw large price increases, and it was actually rising on a week-by-week basis. So once Travis began to recognize the urgency of the inflation and the fuel shortage, he decided to broach the subject with Nikki. Nikki tried her best to catch up with Travis and his research, and it didn't take her long to figure out that the global economy was headed south, and it didn't seem like the American government could get themselves together long enough to do anything about it. And there was nothing about it in the news. One evening, as Travis and Nikki were discussing, Travis says, I think we should just write down what we think is going to happen and what we believe is not going to happen so we can plan better for the future. Travis walked up to this whiteboard, right, and draws a line, and he says, we're splitting it into 3 parts. We're going to say what I believe will happen, what I think may happen, and what I think won't happen. So, what I believe will happen. I believe in 30 months or so, I'll no longer be employed at the airline. Because of the fuel shortage, I believe the airline will eventually go out of business. I believe I will lose my job in the next 24 to 34 months. And because of my age, past salary, global depression, etc., I'll not be able to find another job that pays more than maybe 50% of my existing salary. Because of the fuel shortage, I believe that the industry of the airlines will basically collapse, and most people won't be able to eat even. And because of the fuel shortage, I believe that the other businesses which rely on some sort of fuel will go out of business. And I believe that things will become so pricey, including food, that many people won't be able to afford it. So what do I think might happen? I think there might be huge numbers of homeless people, huge numbers of very poor people, and large numbers of people who have jobs that barely keep them afloat. There will be smaller numbers of middle-class business owners making up that center section. And then there'll be a very, very small number of rich people who still try to control everything. What I think won't happen, I don't think it'll be a continuation to be able to afford the current lifestyle. I don't think the government will collapse completely. I don't think civilization will collapse completely. I don't believe the conspiracy theories being posted on the internet. I think that oil and gas will become much more expensive as the cheap stuff runs out. I think most people won't be able to pay for gas in their cars. Perhaps that's fine, but having higher prices for gas doesn't just make it more expensive for us to get to work. It makes everything more expensive that's shipped from one point to another. Think about the domino effect. If we had to pay 20% more for everything, And we could start without a lot of daily purchases, which might cost jobs, right? And then those people wouldn't be able to find any jobs. So they wouldn't be able to pay for things, and then so on and so on. It builds and builds. And eventually the economy has the potential of crashing because of a lack of spending. I don't think most people are ready to hear this or even want to hear it. They're too conditioned by the media and the government to think that anything bad would happen in America. They would just think that some genius or some government program would come along with a plan and make everything better without any pain on my part. This came from a book called Out of Gas, and different characters, different approaches to the solution, of course, but the concepts and the things that the couple wind up doing is pretty incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And they wind up making some huge changes in their lives. And I'm not talking, we go off and live off the grid or anything like that. They still live a normal life, but they do change their approach to life. From your point of view, Ed, what do you think they did right initially?
Well, I mean, it depends on how you want to look at it, because a lot of people in the world, they believe that ignorance is bliss, and they'd probably think that they would be just as happy if they were none the wiser, and Travis didn't stick his nosy snoot in the business and start doing his own research. But that can be argued, I guess, by some people, but by others, especially probably most of the people who are our audience, they would say what they did right was they basically did their research, and once he got his wife up to speed, they kind of made sure that they were collaborating on the same page. So at least they were getting their facts straight. They weren't jumping to conclusions. They were just trying to make sure, not doing this 2 to 5 minute internet research. They were doing real research. They were probably collecting from 10 to 15 different sources on different topics and looking at the trends and patterns and getting the facts that they were already given, starting with the guy giving him that tip off that he probably shouldn't have given him to, because then that goes to corporate interests where they might find somebody in that kind of situation, probably sign a non-disclosure agreement or an NDA. And if they found out, hey, this guy tipped off this person here, we could be talking about potential insider trading scenarios or whatever else. So it opens itself up to a lot of discussion on preparedness and financial preparedness, especially.
Absolutely. I think the best thing that he did is dug in deep into the research. They bring up a term in there that he did his own kind of consumer price index. Let's look at the definition of consumer price index real quick. Merriam-Webster defines consumer price index as an index measuring the change in cost of typical wage earner purchases of goods and services expressed as a percentage of the cost of these same goods and services in the same base period. The number he used was something like 10 to 15%. And if you look up consumer price index, rarely does it ever go over 7 or 8%. If you look at the history, you'll see there's numbers that go back, and they probably go back further, but the ones I found readily available were 2011 to 2021. It's a little freaky.
Yeah.
Because you look at down in 2011, 2012, 13, it's all around 1.5, 1.6, maybe up in the 2s, all the way through to 2021. Any guesses on where it's at now? Or where it was in the second half of 2021?
12%.
Oh, not quite. 7%.
So,
yeah.
Which
but
is
still, that's what, 5 times the normal CPI?
Yeah, I hadn't done research on that end for those things in a while, but if you're typical American doing the 8 to 5 white collar thing and you start thinking about things like this and you say, wait a second, like 85% or more of us really every year we're getting maybe a 4% raise and bonus and stuff like that. That's just barely edging up above that CPI or cost of living type stuff. So
yeah. And sometimes not even above. Sometimes like Kristen and her job, I mean, she's been there 2 or 3 years with the county government. And I think the most she's seen is maybe a 3% increase. That's a little nerve-wracking when you see that your income is not keeping up with inflation.
This opens up a lot of discussion on a lot of things. If you're a thinker and somebody that likes to think outside of the box, especially when you're talking about white collar type stuff in America, you're dealing with having to do a lot of annual training on things like insider trading, which most workers in the white collar area aren't going to be exposed to that, but they have you go through that training every year, and bribery, corruption, everything else like that. So there's possible touching on that, but nobody tells you what kind of product are you pushing out? How much does it cost us? What is the supply chain type of issues? What is our overhead? Are we going to have to make cuts here and there? But you start seeing your stocks go down, and here you coming across a scenario where this guy specifically told Travis, well, because of this and this. Now, in reality, Travis could have taken that information and actually invested in other different things. If somebody could have, if he did enough of this research based on high level insider information, he could be getting investigated for insider trading type stuff. Additionally, if you are a blue collar worker and you're working in the oil field, or you're a cowboy, a ranch hand, a construction, auto mechanic, all of that kind of stuff, that's a hard skill. You're actually the one putting rubber on the road and steel on target. It's funny, in a lot of those realms, those are the guys that are the men and women that provides us the tangible benefits, but they don't have to go through all of this certain different Mickey Mouse, Kabbalistic, esoteric type of training every year. And you have all of these huge, almost corporate entities that's supposedly educational or accredited, that's a pay to play in the white collar world, saying, okay, you're going to be in this white collar realm, and you got to go through a certain number of continuing education credits every year. You have to do a certain number of learning management, LMS courses every year. And a lot of it is completely irrelevant to what you're doing, number one. And number two, if you pay your mafia piso to them with $150 a year or whatever, you get to be in good standing with certified anti-money laundering specialists or whatever else. So there's a lot going on here. And if you start to see these types of hiccups in the system, I think you owe it to yourself to do your due diligence and start researching it to see how things could tangibly impact you.
My next question is actually around what may they have done wrong. If you read through the entire story, the real story, it's not necessarily what they did wrong, but how they initiated, how they started their whole lives. Because there was part of it, one of the very first things that Travis does is he says, I got to stop this way of living, because we're both executives in our organizations, right? They're upper class. They have 2 kids. They barely ever see their kids. And that's the first thing he does. I don't care what it takes, business-wise or work-wise, I have to find time to be around my kids, because he was working the typical 60, 70 hours a week. They were dropping their kids off at the grandparents or at the daycare or whatever it might be, and they never saw their kids. So that was the first thing they did change. But just having that lifestyle where they're living in excess, even though they're upper class, that concept of paying for something with a credit card is just, I did it for years, makes me frustrated, because you still wind up paying 20 years later, 30 years later, you still wind up paying for that debt. What are some of the things that you would think they could have done better or that they didn't do right?
Well, I'm going to go on to more. I mean, I don't think they have to make hard changes, but I think, especially when you get in your 30s, 40s, 50s, you're educated, trained, you have experience. A lot of your kids may be nesting a little bit, but they're starting to leave. And I'm actually supervising, kind of a supervisor and kind of in the middle. I've got people over me and people a little bit this side of me that I'm supervising that are retired 20 plus year law enforcement veterans, like federal law enforcement. So one guy, he's 57, 58 years old. I was talking to him the other day and he's like, well, I'm divorced. I've got my dog and I'm happy. The kids are out of the house. I've got my retirement. Now I've got this job with the company here now. I'm fine, but you have a lot of different lifestyles and attitudes and behaviors. There's a million different things to talk about here. Did he make some right decisions for him? He's trying to, what I want to try to say is break it down and say 30, 40, 50, you have to make periodic reevaluations or reassessments of how happy you are. Where are you at? Where do you want to be? Is this what you're doing that is making you happy? And I forgot who it was, but somebody challenged me to think about the things that made you happy as a kid. What did you do? Did you play baseball? Did you enjoy it? Or was it something that you were doing to mostly appease your mother and father?
Mm-hmm.
What was it that you used to do as a kid and you truly enjoyed? And why are you no longer doing that now? Is it something you've grown out of or whatever? On this scenario you're talking about to discuss, I don't think they did anything really wrong. And I think they just needed to make a little bit of a tweak, make that periodic reassessment. They did their research. They didn't jump to conclusions. But I'd like to quote Marty Bird of the Netflix Ozark series on money laundering.
Yeah.
The very first episode of the first season, opening scenes, he's saying things like, let me scratch, wampum, dough, sugar, clams, loot, gills, bones, bread, bucks, money, that which separates the haves from the have-nots. But what is money? It's everything if you don't have it, right? Half of all American adults have more credit card debt than savings. 25% have no savings at all. Only 15% of the population is on track to fund even 1 year of retirement, suggesting what? The middle class is evaporating or the American dream is dead. You would be sitting there listening to me if the latter were true. You see, I think most people just have a fundamentally flawed view of money. Is it simply an agreed upon unit of exchange for goods and services? $3.70 for a gallon of milk, $30 to cut your grass? Or is it an intangible security or happiness, peace of mind? Let me propose to you a third option. Money is a measuring device. You see, the hard reality is how much money we accumulate in life is not a function of who's president or the economy or bubbles bursting or bad breaks or bosses. It's about the American work ethic, the one that made us the greatest country on earth. So that said, we have this capitalist thought, and we even have people, I think it was The Rock, saying that he noticed that every time he worked harder, he actually gained more. But more of what? If you're going to work harder and you're going to work longer hours, time is wealth as well. So how much time do you have now? So I think, Matt, just go back to that point I wanted to make is reassess, make those periodic reassessments of who you are, what makes you happy, where are you, where do you want to be, look back on where you have been and say, okay, this is what I researched to be the current situation. And this is what I think we have to do to make these slight tweaks to get to where we want to be to make us happy and an agreed upon measure of happiness and fulfillment in life.
You hit the nail on the head there with an agreed upon measure of happiness. Very important. And you'll notice in the story there, one of the things they did, and I'm not sure the point got across as well as the original author, and that is they sat down together. They both did their individual research. They both separated, went off, listed things they thought would happen, might happen, and will not happen. And they both just started scribbling down things on this whiteboard. I shortened it for the purpose of this discussion, but they both wound up writing things and very, very similar results based on their independent study and research that they did. But what they did is they allowed each other to talk about those situations and then go, now, how do we want to come out of this? We see that something may potentially happen in another year or 2 years, but how do we want to come out of this? If we expect only one of us to have a job, and that one job is only making 50% of what I'm making today, we would be in the future living on a quarter of what we're making today. You said little tweaks and things like that. Certain circumstances, man, it's huge. It's a huge change for them. In this case of Travis and Nikki, and they purposefully said, we're done with this. We can't continue living that way.
To me, they would seem like a small change. And if you talk about it with your partner and family, they might seem like a small change at first, but you're right. They could be huge changes because you could be used to going to work every day and buying a $20 or $30 lunch.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
When I first moved into Dallas, when I first got my first anti-money laundering type of job, I was hired on as a contractor. And I'm not going to lie, they paid me quite well. I was single. I was living in an apartment. And I probably gained 10 or 20 pounds in the first 3 or 4 months because I was going to all the fancy restaurants in Dallas. I was having wine, scotch. I was having $25 to $35 shots of Johnny Walker Blue or Talisker or those types of scotch. I was having $35 to $75 seafood steak plates. And when you talk about the change, those are the types of changes that I made. And they seem like small tweaks to me, but you looking back, they're huge. When I met Nisha and we got married, we started this whiteboard of who are we, where have we been, where are we at, where do we want to be? These are the types of changes that we're going to make. And in the future, if something like this happens, what can you do to readjust that? And while you're reassessing, mutually agreed upon happy spot that you want to be in the future, are we going to refinance the house and get the house payment down another $200 to $400 a month? Or are we going to pull some of that money out? We got money in savings over here, money in savings over there. And if you're looking at leadership for the entire community, what is that we can do to try to help all of our friends, family, and neighbors financially try to get those goals? Because there's leaders in the white collar community that they're leasing Porsches and stuff like that because that's the lifestyle that they want to have. Yeah. There is a lot of jockeying and posturing for a social position in this area that I'm in. And if these economic impacts were to occur in their life, I mean, just so everybody knows, if you're in the spaces that Matt and I are in, more like white collar spaces, I'll say that probably at least 30% of managers above us are actually legacy. They come from families that already had legacy wealth or affluence. Grandfather or somebody invested in this company and they pulled strings to get grandson a job fresh out of high school as a manager in a place out here. And we're talking about people that you say screw up a cup of coffee, they would screw up a glass of water. And they would drive that Porsche down the road until it ran out of gas. And then it's running out of gas on the tollway, causing the traffic jam. There's some of those people out there, and we're going to have to deal with them because they can shoulder surf on me and look over at what I'm doing and say, Ed, I have no clue how you're doing this anti-money laundering transactional analysis. Now we're going to say, hey, you're supposed to be supervising me.
That's exactly right. Well, hey there, Gen Xers. Ed and I wanted to introduce you to PackRabbit, our newest affiliate group. PackRabbit grew from one person's desire to craft a healthier and more efficient way to carry a pack. Now, PackRabbit is a small company made up of entrepreneurs, hunters, athletes, military, and outdoor enthusiasts. Their designs are influenced by diverse backgrounds and personal experiences that tilt them heavily towards simplicity and utility. PackRabbit believes that multifunctionality is not a condition of luxury, but an absolute necessity. One key aspect of several of their backpacks is a folding shelf that turns into a rather comfy seat when out on the trail. We invite you to check them out. The link for their website is in the show notes. I've got two more questions. First of all, do you think it's effective and realistic to plan for something like this that's seemingly way out there? I mean, the fundamental problem here is that, first off, a regional airline runs out of fuel for their airplanes. But then underneath that, there's the lack of fuel from any of their providers to fill the gap, which means that there's a lack of fuel in the Middle East where the fuel is coming from. So then there's a question of, well, can the fuel reserves within the United States be provided to supplement that lack? Or would the US government be willing to sacrifice those fuel reserves in order to fill the gaps for certain companies or whoever it may be? And so it's very, very quickly starts to become a much bigger problem.
Very complicated too.
In that case, you hope that the fuel reserves we do have can supplement. But the question is that really an out there type of scenario that you don't need to worry about it? Would it be better if we had some way of preparing for that type of scenario?
Well, you're asking the wrong person, Matt, because I'll tell you right now, people listening in our audience, if you guys have seen the news once or twice in the last 20 years that some US headquartered global or international corporation either went bankrupt or was found to be so complicit in fraud or criminal activity that their top CEOs are still in prison to this day, Iran. If you've heard of stories like that once or twice, you are about a light year behind where you need to be awareness wise. This is not something that happens once or twice. It is not something that happens occasionally or even frequently, almost daily. I would say monthly at the very least. A major global corporation headquartered in the US either dissolves, gets bankrupt because of bad spending, bad decisions made by its management and leadership, CEOs and everybody, or they sell to a company. As soon as they sell, I guarantee you your jobs are going to be wiped out in a lot of those situations because they're going to offshore them. Something like this happens, and there's currently nobody still employed with Enron. Enron is gone. There's probably a huge leadership change at HSBC after their scandal, Wells Fargo after their scandal. These are just a few financial institutions or others I can think off the top of my head. If you just Google something like U.S. corporations involved in a scandal or fraud or corruption, you'll see just how often and frequently this stuff happens within probably 5 to 10 minutes of research. So it is a realistic scenario. What can you do to prepare for it? Well, you have your training, education, and experience. If you're in your 30s, 40s, or 50s, you should have enough of a foundation that if something happens, you can lateral to another unit within the company, to another corporation or something like that. And you could take drop in pay.
Yeah.
Now, I left one company a while back for many reasons, but one of the main reasons was that its stock that was at $12 to $14, whatever, went down to about $1.75 because they were under $250 million deferred prosecution agreement because there were people inside that were corrupt and facilitating fraud, according to the Department of Justice releases. They initially wanted to try to file for bankruptcy, but the powers that be, the power brokers of King Solomon, those that claim that they are doing God's work to this day, people like the CEOs of Goldman Sachs, they said, no, we're not going to let you file for bankruptcy. We're going to float you this $1 billion loan, and you're going to stay afloat, and we want a return on our investment as well. Then they tried to sell the company to Donald Trump's Chinese friend, Jack Ma, who's running Ant and Alibaba. He's affiliated with those anyway. Now the Chinese government has him almost on lockdown. Nobody's heard of him in a while. And eventually they couldn't sell themselves to anybody, and their stock went down. And it looked like, I mean, people were bailing out of that like rats coming off of a sinking ship. But if you have the training, background, education, experience, you should be able to get to another company. If you're a blue collar and you have hard skills and you're working as a truck driver or in the oil field or something, and your truck line goes out of business or whatever, you can find another job working with the railroad. It's not that there's not jobs out there. Walmart is now starting to pay $15 to $18 an hour. I mean, that I think is also an indicator of where the interest rates are going in the country. I think we are having there's a recession, there's some economic impacts, and we're saying, oh, we're going to pay you more money. Come over here, work for us. We're going to pay you more money. Well, there's a lot of people still getting that COVID relief and unemployment, and they've made the life adjustment that this is sustaining them. Maybe they don't have the same amount of drive and ambition to achieve or accomplish that other people do. And they're fine with that, living in, and they have the opportunities. They have the opportunities for training, vocational training, education and whatnot, but they want to live in a cheap apartment and just eat peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and ramen and oatmeal every day.
Yeah.
But if you're one of those others that's more of an achiever, and this is where you said you've wanted to do, where you want to be and everything else like that, you've got to make that adjustment. And you might have to tighten your waistline a little bit, tighten your belt, but you're going to make ends meet. You got to have faith that at the end of the day, you are going to get through this. Like Eleanor Roosevelt said, this too shall pass.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of people, I'm sure, would hear a story like this and they would get discouraged, feel like it's a dismal outlook. But that does bring me to the last question, which is, what do you think the real chances of this happening are? From my perspective, there's actually two parts to the question. What do you think the real chances are? And then if you think there's a good chance of it happening, what can you do to prepare? I'm probably one of those people who have forever just thought, well, it's not going to affect me because I'm going to prepare in my own way. I'm going to prepare my family. I'm going to have a garden. But if you start to think of things a little bit more realistically, if there was a significant increase in the cost of fuel, just fuel, what happens to a country when their expenses increase in a significant way? Like the story goes, if you increase the cost of fuel, maybe you can't get to work that day, but there's all these other things in the background that you're not even thinking of that could affect you. And honestly, the way the characters in the story move forward is fantastic in how they start to basically remove themselves from a non-sustainable system to a sustainable system in an area that is not as affected by those out of fuel situations, such as a small town. If you have a small town where there's milk, there's cattle, yes, it takes gas or fuel to run a tractor. But if you have a community that comes together and gathers the harvest and makes enough corn or enough wheat that can be processed, then as a community, they're taken care of. And they take care of themselves. So I think there's different things that can be done. We as everyday prepper type of people, without making significant, like I'm going to move out into the sticks in Oklahoma or something like that. it's probably not realistic that you're going to be able to recover easily from a scenario like this. The beauty is a scenario like this doesn't happen overnight. It happens
Right.
over a couple of years.
I would argue that it could happen overnight, but in this particular scenario, it's not going to happen overnight. This is going to occur over a period of time.
To that point, it seems like the only reason why it would happen overnight is if it were a nefarious type of situation from the folks in the Middle East or the Russian pipelines or the Chinese wanting to lock down our economy for some reason. So I guess from that perspective, certainly it could happen.
Yeah. So real quickly for my benefit, maybe the audience as well, repeat your last two questions again.
What do you think are the real chances of something like this occurring? And then is there a way, or what do you think can be done to prepare for it?
Okay, that kind of goes back onto some things that we've already discussed. The real chances of this occurring and having tangible impacts on people. There's going to be so many variables out there. For example, fuel and energy. Well, sad to say, it could get into politics. If it was the former president and that administration in office, there might be different outcomes. The current president, maybe we send some troops to energy, oil, and natural gas rich Ukraine, where they have their own personal known business connections. I just don't understand. It doesn't matter what your politic is. And this goes to why are some things in the news and why are some things not in the news?
Yeah.
Instead of talking about, excuse me, Mr. President, you're no longer the vice president with the son railing lines of cocaine off of a hooker's butt in Ukraine. You are now the president and you still have a personal vested interest in Ukraine. Is a known corrupt country from business perspectives, and the company Burisma was a known corrupt entity there.
Mm-hmm.
So you can look at those things and realize there's possibly scenarios where it's going to be political. And that goes into all kinds of different companies. And that's the sadistic reality of life. What is fireproof? Fireproof is the boss's son. It may not be you. It doesn't matter what your training, education, background, and experience is. If you are not in the club, you are expendable. Your whole unit is expendable unless it's sales or marketing, compliance, all this other stuff. We would actually rather not have you guys do compliance at all. We have you as a cost of doing business, compliance, security. So you can actually Google fuel prices and homeland security. Fuel prices and those variables that go into that is actually part of the infrastructure study for homeland security studies. You have to look at this and say, this is actually part of the infrastructure mechanism. It can have a huge impact. So there's actually whole units of military intelligence and homeland security personnel whose part of their job is dedicated to studying these types of often real-time scenarios. So what is the reality of something like this happening? It's a real potential. There's variables, and they could be extremely complicated and political, and that's why you're not seeing it in the news. And what is it that you can do to prepare yourself? You can be a prepper and listen to GenXTalkin, and we're going to talk through these scenarios and bring up a whole bunch of other scenarios. You have to make a decision tree. If this, then we do this. Yeah. If that, then we do this. Is this a yes? Okay, then we're not worried about it. Is this a no? Oh, then there's something over here.
And create milestones there along the line. Yep. If you see this trigger number occur, then do X, Y, and Z. If it stays below this level, no need to be concerned.
This is a beautiful scenario because this is one of those that I've said it 100 times. I'll say it again. In the age of information, ignorance is a choice. And there is a lot of misinformation out there. Instead of wondering about what's going on in the Ukraine and why, or other areas, there's huge multi-billion-dollar decisions happening globally every day. But what are you hearing in the news? You're hearing that 7 years ago, Joe Rogan may have said the N-word. Really? You're hearing that a few days ago, Whoopi Goldberg said something. And then the whole thing, like, oh, they're leaving Spotify and The Rock is backing him up. Oh, now The Rock is not backing him. This is not news.
Cares.
This is not
right.
news that
That's
impacts
right.
you.
Those are distractions.
Those are distractions. And there are things that are going to occur in maybe even day-to-day life that you have no control over, and you may not be able to be prepared for it. Are you going to get in a vehicle accident? Is a tornado going to suddenly hit? Is there going to be something that nobody saw make a huge economic impact that's going to have an impact on you? Life and death. So you could go to sleep one day and just not wake up.
Not wake up. That's right.
However, there are some things in your control, and this is one of them. You can, and I believe the Creator did not put you on this earth to just walk around aimlessly like sheeple and wait for something to happen. Maybe there's a lot of people that are of that mindset, but challenge people and encourage people to actually, you don't necessarily need to be alpha or an apex predator, but you can be alert and you can be aware and you can say, I want to live.
Excellent words there. I don't know how else to finish that up. I would like
to live.
I want to live. So I'm thinking, if you're ready, we can go into parting shots and close this thing down.
Roger that, brother. Let's do it.
You want to go first?
Sure. I'll go first. Gen Xers, my parting shots for this would be, don't let yourself be distracted by news that doesn't have anything to do with anything that's going to have an impact on you. As Gen Xers, I think we're in our 40s, 50s and such. I put this out on one of my TikToks the other day. I encourage us to try to be leaders and not followers, be uniters, not dividers, reach out and try to gather more, not scatter. And let's try to be prepared, because there's going to be a lot of people in generations that are younger than us, not to discredit them. They're the people in Gen Z, the Zoomers, and even your teenage kids these days. They're not stupid. They're sharp. Right. It's just that they've had this phone with an app, and they might arguably have shorter attention spans, but they're sharp. They don't want to be a drone in the hive of life. They want to live, and they're going to look for answers. And one of the things I think Gen Xers in preparedness spaces need to do is learn to be a leader, because you are going to be looked on. It's almost an expectation of you that you're 40, 50 years old. And for you to say, I don't know, kid, I just work here, that's not going to cut it. Not only are you going to have to say, hey, I want to live, you're going to have to be the leader of the pack. So keep your finger on the pulse of these scenarios and the intricate ins and outs of them as best you can without losing sleep over it. That way you can be best prepared for those situations that you can have some control over.
I've got so many different directions for my parting shots that it's really hard for me to focus on just one or the other.
This is a crazy topic.
I'll try to limit it as much as I can. First off, there's a lot of people that say social media has a negative effect on people, like TikTok or Instagram. And gosh, they really can be so distracting from reality, things that are going on around you. But if you curate your feed well enough, you're not locked in an echo chamber. You can still see both sides of the arguments occurring, and you can get an outside opinion of what's happening around us. Which brings up the second point. And I'm saying that for a reason, because I just read an article from this independent news guy sitting there up in New York City, right? He's a pretty smart guy, and he's tied in pretty well to the news world up there. And he wrote an article on news bias and how it happens. He gives some numbers, something like 60% of people in the media are liberal, are leftist. And I guess there's a separation between leftist and liberal. I understand that. But it's something like 60 to 70% of them are. And I feel like that's probably an understatement. There's probably much more than that in reality. They just don't admit it. But the reason I'm bringing that up is the media, is biased one way or another. So if you observe some things that are going in the media and then confirm certain things by looking in your own social media type of environments, and then take the concepts, maybe even go and do your own detailed research, you can get some truth. All that media should be there to do is tell you that something's happening, and I'll give you resources that you can go do your own study, your own research, things like that. That was the number one thing I think the characters in this did very, very well. They did their own research. They dug in. They found some very impactful numbers, how it would affect them individually, and they made their own individual choice.
Yeah.
And they prepared their own families. Not only their own small family, but their extended family, their parents, their grandparents, the people in the community that they moved to. Like you said, Ed, they started gathering people of like mind and saying, we're not going to be ill prepared for these scenarios coming up. We're going to be prepared, and we're going to protect our own. It's hard because I think a lot of things going on in social media is saying, no, you shouldn't go off on your own and do this and just protect your own. You should be doing this for everybody. And that's not the direction. We should be working together, but certain people are going to have common cause. And that's those people who are going to band together and do the right thing for that community. I would just encourage our audience and those outside of our audience to watch, learn, research, and be prepared for those things that are coming. That's all I had for today.
All right. Well, I think that's awesome, Matt. And I think we can actually probably pick up in another episode, talk about this particular type of situation even more in the future. And before we go, I want to say again, one time real quick to all our listeners out there, we will be doing our best to do a really quick live 2, 3, 4 minute or so update or check-in from Cairo, Luxor, and Hurghada, Egypt coming up next week.
That's going to be so exciting. I'm looking forward to it.
I love this discussion, Matt. This was awesome.
Excellent. Well, Gen Xers, until next time, this is Matt Marshall signing off.
Awesome. Take care, guys.